Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia, with your host, Ben Hurl.
G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. It's amazing how much stuff I can just keep on digging up each week. And being a weekly show, I have the ultimate fear that one day I'm going to run out of material. But there doesn't seem to be any sign of that coming in the near future. And as I've been researching and looking through all sorts of different things, I've decided for this week's show, I'll actually focus on back onto UFOs again. And I've found some really interesting things to talk about. Some of them are well known and others are not so well known, which is the stuff I really like to bring up and talk about. But the first one we're going to talk about tonight is probably a fairly well-known case, actually. And it occurred in 1959, so it's a long time ago. And it actually didn't even occur in Australia. But it occurred in Papua New Guinea, which is just directly above us. And it is perhaps one of the most intriguing UFO cases that I think that I've ever really heard about. And it's very well known. It is very well known. If you've been around UFOs for a while, you will definitely have heard of this case. But if not, then sit back and relax as we have a look at the very well-known Reverend Gill UFO encounter of 1959. It really is incredible. So who was William Gill? He was an Anglican priest with a mission in Boinani in Papua New Guinea. And he observed craft-like UFOs, and the most intriguing part about this particular case is that there were humanoid figures on top. That's right, humanoid figures on top on two consecutive evenings on June the 26th and the 27th of 1959. And about 25 natives, including teachers and medical technicians, also observed the strange phenomena. And most intriguingly of all with this particular case is that they signaled to the humanoids and apparently received a response. So very interesting, going right back in the early days, a case that's always been extremely fascinating to me. And according to Dr. Alan Hynek, during the years 1958 to 1959, there were over 60 UFO sightings reported in the Papua New Guinea area. 60, with many of these sightings occurring in the area of Mount Pudi, which was near the mission of Boinani. And New Guinea at that time was part of Australia, right up until 1975. So that's almost into really modern times. It was still considered to be a part of Australia. Hence, that's why I can talk about it, because at that time it was an Australian territory. And the Australian Anglican Church sent many missionaries to the people of that island nation up there in New Guinea. And Reverend Father Gill, or William Booth Gill was his name, was his full name, he was one of these missionaries, and he began the year 1959 as a complete skeptic, but that was soon to change. And prior to the major events, the knockout events, on April the 5th, 1959, Father Gill saw a light on the uninhabited Mount Pudi that moved faster than any human could move. And then on June 21st, a gentleman called Stephen Moy, who was Father Gill's assistant, he saw what he described as an inverted saucer in the sky above the mission. Now, it's interesting to look at how Father Gill interpreted this, even back on his very first sighting. And in a letter to a friend, he wrote that he had no doubt the existence of these things, and indeed he cannot now that he has seen one himself, but for my simple mind, he still requires scientific evidence before he can accept it from being an outer space theory. So even then, he was still very skeptical about it. And he was inclined to believe that probably many UFOs are more likely some form of electrical phenomena, or perhaps something brought about by the atomic bomb explosion, something like that. And then he said that the fact that his assistant, Stephen, should actually make out a saucer could be the work of the unconscious mind, as it's very likely that at some time Stephen had seen illustrations of some kind in a magazine. Or it's very possible that saucers do exist, but it's only a 50-50 chance that they are not Earth-made, still less that they should carry men. And it's still unproven that they are solids. It's all too difficult to understand for me, and I prefer to wait for some bright boy to catch one exhibited in Martin Square. So he was very skeptical, although he was reluctantly acknowledging the fact that, yes, perhaps these things do exist. So with Father Gill having his own encounter and his assistant, that was all just a prelude to what was going to happen later on in June. So from June 26 through to June 28, at about 6:45 on June 26th, Father Gill, he saw a bright white light to the northwest. And as 38 people at the mission watched, a four-legged disc-shaped object that was approximately the size of 5 full moons, that's how they described it, lined up end to end, hovering over the mission. And on top of the object, they saw 4 human-like figures that appeared to be performing some sort of task on top of the object. Very intriguing. And at times, one or more of these figures would vanish from sight, only to reappear a few minutes later. And at regular intervals, a beam of blue light shone upwards from the center of the craft into the sky. And the object was visible until about 7:30, when it ascended or went up into the clouds and it vanished. And at about 8:30 on that night, several smaller objects appeared in the sky. And at about 8:50, the first object came back. And the 4-hour sighting lasted until 10:50 that night, when clouds moved in and blocked the view. So 6:45 would have been probably a dark or approaching. It's definitely dark here that time of the year. In New Guinea, I'm not 100% sure if it would have been dark or around dusk, but certainly heading into the evening hours. And Father Gill prepared a written report of the sightings, and 25 witnesses actually signed it. You imagine 25 of them all sitting there signing off on this. And the next day, the large object with people on board and 2 of the smaller objects returned at about 6 p.m. So this is on the 27th. And Father Gill described it like this. On the large one, 2 of the figures seemed to be doing something near the center of the deck. They were occasionally bending over and raising their arms as though adjusting or setting up something. And one figure seemed to be standing, looking down at us. So there's a couple of them on top of this object working on something, and another one who is apparently looking down at the people looking up. And Father Gill raised his arm to actually wave at the figure. And to their surprise, the figure returned the wave. And another gentleman who was standing next to him by the name of Aeneas began waving his arms with Reverend Gill. And all four of the beings seemed to wave back. And there seemed to, in the mind of the witnesses, there was no doubt that their movements were being answered. There was more waving and signaling with torches with responses from the UFO. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail a little bit later. And at 6:30 that night, Father Gill went into dinner, if you can imagine that. He leaves this sight that's before him of an object in the sky with the guys on top, and he goes inside for dinner. I suppose that's what you did back in 1959. But at 7 o'clock, the objects were still there, only smaller, as if it had moved further away. And when Father Gill checked again, after church at 7:45, the sky was cloudy and they were gone. And the following evening, going into the third day, the UFOs made their final appearance, or the objects. Father Gill counted 8 of them at 6:45. And oddly, at 11:20 that night, or it was a quiet night, it was shattered by a loud bang on the roof. And Father Gill rushed outside to check what was going on and saw 4 UFOs in a sort of a circle around the building. But they were at a very great height. And they were still there when he returned to bed. And when the roof was checked the next morning, no evidence of an impact was actually found. But even though there was this sound of something hitting the roof. In a signed statement, all the witnesses agreed that the object was circular, had a wide base and a narrower upper deck, and had something like legs sticking out beneath it. And at times it produced a shaft of blue light which shone upwards into the sky at an angle of about 45 degrees. And that 4 humanoid figures appeared on top. Some of the witnesses described seeing 4 portholes or windows on the side of the craft. And Father Gill saw what he appeared to be bright panels on the side, but he did not interpret them as being portholes. So it's just a little bit interesting, isn't it? So that's a lot of the key sort of elements of this case. You know, this object of a particular shape with these distinct leg-like objects protruding underneath it, bright light at 45-degree angle, and humanoids on top doing various activities and perhaps also signalling back down to the people on the ground. Now, the Boynai sighting was analysed by noted debunker Dr. Donald Menzel. And he explained the sightings as being the planet Venus, being viewed myopically by Father Gill. Venus, he said, was very conspicuous in the west, setting about 3 hours after the sun. And Menzel noted that he thought it significant that despite the brilliance of Venus, none of the sightings by Father Gill and the mission group referred to that planet. And Menzel based his conclusions on several speculative assumptions. That Father Gill was nearsighted and without glasses at the time, that he probably had astigmatism, and that caused him to see a distorted image of Venus, plus additionally blood cells on the retina of his eye producing an illusion of motion. And Menzel seemed to have believed that the Papuans were ignorant natives who worshipped Father Gill and merely went along with everything that he said. And that because a real simple way to get rid of the other 24 witnesses in the eyes of a debunker. But Fred Beckman, who was a colleague of Dr. Alan Hynek, went to Papua New Guinea and travelled with Father Gill to the mission, and noted that Father Gill was wearing properly corrected glasses at the time, and that Venus was pointed out separately by Gill. So he was an educated man. I mean, he's a man of the cloth, and he would have generally had a good education, and presumably knew something about stars and planets and things in the sky at the same time. And you've got Father Gill plus all the other natives, and some of them held fairly responsible positions, all testifying that this is what they actually saw. But don't forget, this is 1959. It is the UFO dark ages back then. So we'll just sort of step through it a little bit closer and have a look at step by step what actually happened. And before I do that, I'm going to give you some vision as well, just to point where things are. So this is where it is. So you can see Australia, and directly above Australia is New Guinea. And down on the eastern side is the mission, and that's marked in purple, right down on the tail, literally, of New Guinea. And this is a closer up thing. So it's the mountain that they're talking about is just down to the south of the mission, quite close by. And as Dr. Hynek said, it was a very busy year for UFO reports, and a lot of them coming out from around that area. So that gives you a bit of an idea. So on the first day, the first major day, 6:45, large sparkling light seen by Father Gill in the western skies, a large sparkling light. And he called the natives who also saw it. And on the first night, he stepped out of the front door of the mission house after dinner at 6:45, glanced at the western sky looking for Venus, which was conspicuous at the time, which also eliminates Menzel's theories. And he said, I saw Venus, but I also saw this sparkling object, which to me was peculiar because it sparkled and because it was very, very bright. And it was above Venus, and so that caused me to watch it for a while, and then I saw it descend towards us. That's his words. And Father Gill estimated the object's angular diameter as about 5 inches at arm's length. Stephen Moy, his teacher and assistant, who joined Father Gill a few minutes later, said that if he put his hand out closed, it would cover about half the object. So it was a fairly big object. At 6:55 to 7:04 p.m., so the next 10 minutes, up to 4 illuminated humanoid figures are seen on top of the object, on and off, coming in and out of view. The next 10 minutes, 7:10 to 7:20 p.m., the sky is now overcast at about 2,000 feet, and humanoid figures are seen again, and a thin electric blue spotlight is rising upward from the object, hovering below the overcast, and the UFO disappears into the clouds. A little bit later, at 8:30 to 8:35, the sky is clear again, and the UFO is visible, appearing to descend and increase in size. Second object is seen over sea, hovering at times, and another over the village. So this is around about 8:30. 8:50 to 9:30 p.m., the clouds start forming again. Large stationary UFOs and others, about 3 light discs, coming and going through the clouds. So they're moving through the clouds, casting a light halo on the clouds. The large UFO moves away rapidly across the sea. This is from 8:50 to 9:30. 9:46 to 10:30 p.m., the UFO reappears overhead, hovering. At 10:50, another 20 minutes later, heavy overcast, no sign of the UFO, and by 11 o'clock that night, it was really pissing down rain. Heavy rain. The June 27, so the next day, 6 to 7 p.m., large UFOs seen again. First sighted by a medical technician at the hospital before dark. And it's the closest sighting yet. Seen very clearly, bright and sparkling. Humanoid figures seen on top. Father Gill and about 12 others in a group waved at the humanoids. One of the figures appeared to wave back. One member of the group waved both arms, and the figures responded waving both arms in kind. 2 smaller objects remained visible, but stationary at a higher altitude. As we watched it, Father Gill said, men came out of this object and appeared on top of it, on what seemed to be a deck on top of the huge disc. There were 4 men in all, occasionally 2, then 1, then 3, then 4. We noted the various times the men appeared. And another peculiar thing that he noted was that shaft of blue light emanating from what appeared to be the center of the deck. The men appeared to be illuminated not only by this light reflected on them, but also by a sort of glow which completely surrounded them as well as the craft. So they were illuminated as well. The glow did not touch them, but there appeared to be a little space between their outlines and the light. Interesting. Father Gill described the movements of the object, especially the smaller discs, as being very erratic. They sometimes moved rapidly, sometimes slow, approaching, receding, changing direction, and then swinging back and forth like a pendulum. Crazy stuff. And one object moved away and appeared to descend towards a nearby village. And everybody thought that the object was going to land. And they all ran down to the beach, but the object swooped up and away over the mountains, turning red as it disappeared. And when the large object disappeared, Father Gill said it made a slight wavering motion, then suddenly shot away at tremendous speed. So a bit of a wavering motion, perhaps something like that, and then bang, off it went, changing colour to red and blue-green, disappearing across the bay, vanishing. And interestingly, no sound was heard throughout. So that's amazing. These craft have been entirely silent. 1959. Don't forget that, 1959. So it really was an incredible event. You've just got this amazing encounter that's occurred with, a responsible missionary and the people of the mission. There's really no reason for anyone to make any of this stuff up. And at one point, Father Gill sent one of the natives for a flashlight, and they directed a series of signals or long dashes towards the object. And after a minute or two, the UFO wavered back and forth like a pendulum, and they took that to be an apparent acknowledgement of the torch. They waved and flashed the signals again, and the UFO appeared to descend down towards them, but stopped and came no closer. And after 2 or 3 more minutes, the figures disappeared. And they come back out again, start resuming their activity. And the blue spotlight come on for a few seconds, twice in succession. So, extraordinary. Well worth discussing on this show, because it's just the sort of thing that we are very interested in. Now, the fallout of all of this was that all the investigators, well, all the civilian investigators, let's put it that way, all found Reverend Gill to be very impressive, a credible witness. And this led one of the groups, which was the Victorian Flying Saucer Research Society, which was the original founding UFO group here in Victoria, where I am. They viewed the Gill report as constituting the most remarkable testimony of intensive UFO activity ever reported to civilian investigators at that time, 1959. And they were unique because for the first time, credible witnesses had reported the presence of humanoid beings associated with UFOs. And the major civilian groups of the day, in a spirit of newfound cooperation, inspired by the significance of the observations, distributed copies of Gill's sighting reports to all members of the House of Representatives of Australia's federal parliament. And a letter accompanied the report. So the civilian groups took this very, very seriously at the time. And the letter accompanied the report, signed by the presidents of the participating civilian groups, urging members of the parliament to press the Minister for Air for a statement about the attitude the Australian Air Force intelligence had to the New Guinea reports. So they tried to get a bit of motion around this experience. And on the 24th of November, so we've moved from June, from the time of the sightings, through to November 1959, in federal parliament, a Mr. Cash, a Liberal member for Western Australia, he asked the Minister for Air, who was Osborne, whether his department, specifically Air Force Intelligence, had investigated the reports. And the minister's reply did not address this question, but instead focused on the general situation, indicating that most sightings of UFOs were explained and that only a very small percentage, something like 3% of reported sightings could not be explained. And a representative of one of the UFO groups was advised by the Directorate of Air Force Intelligence that the department was awaiting depth of evidence on the New Guinea sightings. But the department had not even interviewed Reverend Gill. Unbelievable. Finally, the Minister for Defence requested a report, and the RAF interviewed Reverend Gill on the 29th of December 1959, practically 6 months after the sighting. And Reverend Gill's recollection of the visit is that the two officers from Canberra talked about stars and planets, and then they left. And he heard no more from them. This is very much the dogma of the day back in that time period. It was to explain everything away at all costs. And as one might expect, Reverend Gill's account was dismissed by the Royal Australian Air Force, despite its extraordinary nature of what was reported and the number of witnesses in an Australian territory at that time. And the senior interviewing officer, Squadron Leader F.A. Lang, concluded that although Reverend Gill could be regarded as a reliable observer, it's felt that the June-July incidents could have been nothing more than natural phenomena, coloured by past events and subconscious influences of UFO enthusiasts. What the hell does that mean? In 1959 in Papua New Guinea, I don't think so. During the period of the report, the weather was cloudy and unsettled with light thunderstorms. Although it's not possible to draw firm conclusions, an analysis of rough bearings and angles above the horizon does suggest that at least some of the lights observed were the planets Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars all of a sudden. And light refraction, the changing position of the planets relative to the observer, and cloud movement would give the impression and size of rapid movement. And in addition to that, the varying cloud densities could account for the human shapes and their sudden appearance and disappearance. Well, that's all very convenient, isn't it? The Australian Air Force has wrapped that one up into a really explainable solution that's basically puts that aside, and we've explained that one. And this is an extraordinary sighting, and you can imagine that happening now anywhere in the world, or even in New Guinea. Those mobile phones would be out there snapping and taking lots of video. But in 1959, New Guinea was a much more remote place. It's still a remote place today in many ways, but in 1959, it was so much more. That was so much more the case. So I did find but before I do that, I'll bring up a picture. This is Reverend Gill. So that's him on the right, and that's one of the paintings or illustrations that was done that represents that event. So he was a very, very educated gentleman, and he had nothing to gain by reporting this in good faith. And this was his assistant, Mr. Stephen Moy. It's a photo of him, relatively rare photo, and a couple of other pictures I've got here of the two women who also saw it on the second day, the hospital technician who saw it, and that's that. And this is Reverend Gill's own sketch of the object, and hopefully I've been able to describe it to you, but a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you can see the object and the protrusion sticking underneath it and the four little objects, and there's this glow around the whole thing that you can probably imagine, and then off to that 45 degrees, that electric blue shaft of light that was going up into the sky. What were they doing up there? Wouldn't it be great to know what they were doing up there? And this is another image of the natives at the time waving at the figures on top. And it's interesting to note that Reverend Gill himself still regarded them as humans, was still wanting to believe that he was looking at humans on top of this. He didn't understand the technology, no idea, but his mindset was that he was, even though he could make out very little detail, no facial features or anything like that, that in his mind that these were still humans. And this is a really whiz-bang image of it that I was able to find online. That may or may not be entirely accurate, but perhaps gives it a bit more of a 21st century feel to what the object may have looked like. And, and it's hard, you got to think back in 1959, they're trying to describe, something that's incredible. And they have got no way of capturing it other than their descriptions and a couple of basic drawings. But in the 21st century, as you can see, we can do some really good renderings of what it might have looked like. The figurines, the figures on top of the craft. So I'm just going to play a little short interview that Reverend Gill did, and you can listen to his take.
Can you imagine what it's like to look up in the sky and see a totally foreign-looking object there, just hovering, not very far high up, maybe 200 or 300 feet up in the air, and glowing, and two bipods jutting out from behind it, from underneath it, and sparkling all around, and some figures up there. This solid-looking object, and figures walking about on top, and not the slightest noise whatsoever. And so we waved. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get this object down onto the playing field? And as we waved, wondering whether we'd get some recognition and whether perhaps they would understand what we wanted, they waved back. So I asked the boy to go quickly down, bring me a torch, bring me a pencil, bring me paper, and return as quickly as you can so that I can get or any other events that occur and minute-by-minute movements, so that at least we'd be able to talk about it the next day. And this he did very, very quickly. He brought it back, and he brought the torch and put the torch on and shone it to the craft. And as he did so, he waved moved the torch this way. And we were dumbfounded when we looked at the craft, and the craft was as though it was responding to the torch. It began to do this too, like a disc-shaped object, just moving the same way, responding to the movement of the torch. Next day, just prior to the evening service, about 7 o'clock, the thing was there again. It had arrived about an hour earlier, and we all decided to have the normal evensong that we do have on those nights, because, the thing was out there outside the church anyway, and we felt it wouldn't go away during the service, and it didn't. When we came out, there it was, still up in the sky. And so for another hour or two, we watched. And then suddenly it did go. And there was this amazingly incredible speed that the whole craft disappeared to nothing across the bay in a matter of a second or so. Well, now, what are we to think of this kind of phenomenon? People claiming to see things such as I did. There were 38 of us, and we all believe that we saw it, but of course we don't expect other people to believe us if they don't want to.
So there you go. That's straight from Reverend Gill's mouth himself. So it's interesting to note even his attitude at the end there, that we know what we saw, but we don't necessarily expect other people to believe what we experienced. So it becomes a very personal thing to witnesses when they do that. And in 1959, there would have been a fairly high rate of skeptics out there in society in general. But there still people would have had their believers. And at the end of the day, the truth is the truth. So that's an interesting thing. So we're going to move along now. I'm going to talk about another interesting encounter. And this one probably is not so well known, certainly a lot less well known than the Reverend Gill encounter. And I myself had never even heard of it until recently. And it's really going back into the 1930s. So it's going back a little bit earlier again. And again, we're kind of off Australia a little bit in that this was an encounter that occurred across the Tasman Sea between New Zealand and Australia. in the 1930s. And it occurred to a gentleman called Sir Francis Chichester. And I'll put a picture up of him, what he looks like. This is him here. And he was quite an incredible man. And we'll have a look at what made him so incredible. And so he was originally born in Devon, England, the son of a Church of England clergyman. And at the age of 6, he was sent as a boarder to the Old Ryde Preparatory School for boys. And he then attended Marlborough College. And during World War I, at the age of 18, he emigrated to New Zealand, where in 10 years, he built up a prosperous business in forestry, mining and property development. This is at the age of 18, only to suffer severe losses in the Great Depression. And after returning to England in 1929 to visit his family, Francis Chichester took flying lessons at Brooklands, Surrey, and he qualified as a pilot. And he then took delivery of a de Havilland Gypsy Moth aircraft, which he intended to fly to New Zealand. So this is real Biggle stuff. This is boys' own back in that time. And he was hoping to break Bert Hinkler's record solo flight back to Australia on the way. Now, while mechanical problems meant that the record eluded him, he completed the trip in 41 days. Think about 41 days and you can basically fly to England in a day now. So we've come a long, long way. And the aircraft was then shipped to New Zealand. And finding that he was unable to carry enough fuel across the Tasman Sea, he had his Gypsy Moth fitted with floats, borrowed from the New Zealand Permanent Air Force, it was known at that time. And he went on to make the first solo flight across the Tasman Sea from east to west. Now that's from New Zealand to Australia. The first man to fly solo across the Tasman Sea, New Zealand to Australia. He was also the first man to land an aircraft on Norfolk Island and Lord Howe Island. So what's a Gypsy Moth, I hear you ask? This is a Gypsy Moth. That's what a Gypsy Moth looks like. So if you can imagine flying from New Zealand to Australia in one of those, you certainly are made of stern stuff. And his actual plane looked like this. So he had the pontoons put on, which was probably a fairly sound idea. So the trip was delayed after his aircraft was damaged at Lord Howe, and he had to rebuild it himself with the help of islanders. So there you go. This is still back in the day of DIY and probably some wire and some wood and taping things back together for the flight across to Australia. So, and his navigation back in those days was very, very, it was a very almost hit and miss style of navigation that they used. And I was going to read about that, but it's relatively sort of lengthy, and perhaps we won't bother with that, reading through, how they actually navigated. But he really had a strange encounter when he was out there. So while he was midway over the Tasman Sea, he encountered a strange aerial craft, and he noticed, and he called it an exceedingly curious aerial vehicle moving towards him. This is in 1931. And he assumed that he had encountered a new type of airship. So again, here he is assuming that it's something that is man-made, not something unusual. And he said that it was puzzlingly cocooned in white. It had this white sheen around it, or white material that flashed in the sun. And 3 decades later, in his book, which was called The Lonely Sea and Sky, he confessed his naivety. And he was convinced by then, 3 decades later, that he had in fact seen a UFO, long before the term was invented, and long before flying saucer was even invented. And in a violent overture to the drama, Chichester's plane was pushed off course by buffeting winds using the ocean's surface and crests of feathering waves as a guide to altitude, he wrestled the aircraft through the isolated storms for more than an hour until he caught sight of clearer weather ahead. And the welcome sight was accompanied by that awe-inspiring spectacle, a pattern of dazzling lights in the sky 30 degrees west. And he said there were bright flashes like the glints of a heliograph. He saw a grey-white airship coming towards him, a grey-white ship coming towards him, like an oblong pearl. Like an oblong pearl. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Like an oblong pearl. Made me think of this. That's the first thing that came to mind for me, an oblong pearl. And then this is another image that I plucked that perhaps kind of reflects what he's talking about, because there are no photos of this. So this oblong pearl, and except for a cloud or two, there was nothing else in the sky. He looked around, sometimes catching a flash or a glint, and he twisted the plane to look at the airship more closely. But he found it had disappeared, and he screwed his eyes up, unable to believe that, and he twisted the seaplane this way and that way, thinking that the airship might be hidden by a blind spot, but he still could not pick out anything. And then out of some clouds in front, he saw another, or the same airship approaching. And he watched it with great intensity and was determined not to look away for even a second. And the airship grew even closer until it was about a mile away, and then it vanished. And then it reappeared close to where it had vanished. And it drew closer, and he could see the dull gleam of light on its nose, and back it came towards him. But instead of increasing in size, the object diminished as it approached. And when it came quite near, the airship became, in his own words, its own ghost. 1 second he could see through it, and the next it had vanished into the flashes, and then the flashes also. So it was flashing, these flashes were going, and it disappeared into the flashes. And all of this was seen years before anyone spoke of UFOs. And in 1931, it seemed to Sir Chichester to be very much like what people called flying saucers. So that's an incredible story. In the early 30s, on the first crossing from New Zealand to Australia, he encounters and flying around in one of these things. Like, that's bravery. That's one brave man. That's what he's got out there against something like that, or maybe even that, because the description does not vary that much. He described it as an oblong pearl-shaped object. So that's just a fascinating encounter, and I'd never heard of it, and I don't think many people would really know about that case. For someone who's an incredibly credible witness. So that's a fascinating encounter. Now, I also want to talk about, to close out this episode, the mystery of the spinning sea lights. This is another really strange phenomena. Sea lights, spinning sea lights. And I've got an example of this particular phenomenon. And it was the eeriest but most beautiful spectacle that Queensland master mariner Norman Fraser had ever encountered. And the time was 3 a.m. on the morning of the 4th of November, 1997. So not that long ago, 1997. And he was standing watch on the supply ship Ocean Worker in the Bay of Bengal. And without warning, the dark sea, this is at 3 a.m., began to pulsate. The sea began to pulsate and then brilliantly shine as though the sun was rising from the seabed. And as Fraser and his shipmate Sam Apaya watched, awed, luminously green patches of light spun around the vessel at increasing speed. And before long, the patches had formed huge rotating wands of green light in the water. And Norman Fraser recalled that the curved spokes turned from a central hub at more than 80 rotations a minute. 80 rotations a minute. And the spinning light mass was visible as far beyond the ship as the eye could see. So it's extended out to horizon. Now, he took careful notes of what he and Sam Apuya had seen. And the stretch of ocean in which the display occurred is known for bioluminescent organisms, but the organised immensity of the rotating pattern posed a puzzle that science to this day has still not begun to even remotely solve. And light wheels like this example have also been seen off the coast of Western Australia and were recorded by mariners for years. And an author called Kay Kiltson observed one in 1909, going back in time, aboard the ship called Bintang. Not the beer, but the ship's called Bintang in the Indian Ocean. And he recalled waves of light moving across the surface of the sea from west to east. And gradually they took the shape of long rays, again, rotating clockwise. And these rays were not straight, but concave. And the previous year, the captain of a Russian trading vessel noted that suddenly an unusual light, white and green in colour, broke out underneath the stern of the boat and soon occupied most of the ocean's surface. The light pattern was oval in shape and moved from some time with the ship, and then gradually separated from the ship and flew ahead underwater at great speed and shining brightly. So it flew ahead under the water at great speed, shining brightly. On the 28th of December, my birthday, 1929, the British steamship Talma was off the eastern shore of the Bay of Bengal again, en route from Calcutta to the Far East. And the weather was calm and clear. And towards 7 in the evening, an extraordinary display of luminosity was seen in the surrounding sea. At first, the captain's report what appeared like small globules of fluorescence rising from below and breaking at the surface were observed. And later these assumed an appearance almost like flashes of lightning under the water, which rapidly formed into regular beams, curved as the curved spokes of a wheel might be, and at a width at the ship of about 30 feet. These revolved rapidly from right to left at the rate of 2 a second, timed as the beams passed the bridge around a distant centre, which could not actually be seen clearly, but appeared to be about 5 miles off. And this centre passed ahead of the ship, being first observed on the port beam, and from there drawing slowly ahead and across the bows of the ship, fading gradually till on the starboard bow, when the whole phenomenon disappeared about 15 minutes after it had begun. Fascinating. And these beams are generally described as curved with their concave sides in the direction which they move. And most of the displays are reported to last for only a few minutes. So it really is a very, very unusual phenomenon indeed. And this is the images that I've found that describe what these water wheels actually look like. So these rotating, spinning lights that appear under the sea. That's one image, and this is another image that shows a ship and with the waves of these lights going across them. So it's a really interesting phenomena that's occurred, here in Australia, and obviously up around India there as well, and probably in other parts of the world as well. A really interesting phenomenon, and I don't really know how to describe it. Is it a UFO phenomenon? Who knows? It may or may not be. So that's, I don't know what more to say. It's really, very, very, very interesting. So I'm sort of coming close to the end of the episode, but we've still got a few minutes left to go. And I want to talk about a crop circle encounter. So on the 25th of February, 1966, there was an article in the Brisbane Telegraph, and something strange had occurred. Now, a woman school teacher who would not give her name said that something that was pear-shaped with a beam of light extending from the blunt end and was travelling low and fast. A constable on his way home from police headquarters said an oval-shaped machine sped from the sky and hovered low about 60 feet above the ground, with red flames shooting from it. Shadows of some people, he said, could be seen for several seconds in this object. And a Mrs. Maureen Clune of Punchbowl said that she and her neighbours had seen mysterious white lights each night near the Bankstown airport. And she was quoted as saying, "Last night I saw a single very bright light hovering in the sky about 9 p.m. And when the position of the nest was described to her, Mrs. Clune said the light she saw was very close to it. So there was a circle on the ground. And the nest looked as if it had been flattened by a huge disc. The tall reeds had been depressed into the mud as if by some tremendous force, and were in a perfect clockwise position. And Robert Dennis said that he and Larry Stewart first noticed the nest on February the 14th. So remember, this article appeared on the 25th, so quite a few days later. And these were two boys, and we always take the same track home from school, and we are sure that the nest was not there the previous Friday. And when we found it, we noticed a particular pungent chemical smell which seemed to hang in the air. The reeds also were bent at the base and not broken. And we had noticed ourselves that if you try to flatten the reeds, they break off at the stem. And he said the nest seemed to have been forced by some huge downward draft of air moving in a circular motion. And this is the picture of that particular impression. And that's the boys in the center there. So a really, really interesting and classical, absolutely classical crop circle that you could say, swirled wheat on the ground or grass, reeds, and but what I found interesting about this one was the fact that they reported that there was a pungent smell associated with it, which I've not heard that commonly before. So I thought I would share that with you as well. And I've got quite a few here, but the time is ticking down. We'll talk about this one here. So again, April 12th, 1973. So we've moved through the years a bit in this episode. In the Brisbane Courier Mail, a Mr. and Mrs. David Hebron said they were returning home to their hometown of Proston, about 125 miles northwest of Brisbane, when a large bright disc appeared beside their vehicle. A large bright disc. And Mr. Hebron said he was driving past the Wandle Cemetery when he heard a noise like a jet passing overhead. And then he saw the object, which gave off a reddish yellow light. And he said the object chased the car for 8 to 9 miles. Fair way. And after it became obvious it was chasing us, there was no way that we were going to pull up, he said. And just before it disappeared, it seemed to come very close and bright, and he felt like he could have reached out and actually touched it. But then the car gave a shudder, as if hit by a strong gust of wind, and the object disappeared. Mr. Hebron, who was a truck driver, said the incident occurred at about 9:30 p.m. on the Sunday in April 1973. And his wife said that we were terribly scared. The thing flew alongside us for miles. It wasn't an aircraft, that's for sure. She said the object was shaped like the bottom crescent of the moon, and travelling about 300 yards from their vehicle until it came in close shortly before it disappeared at high speed. And they thought it was the moon at first, but then it started to follow them. And she said, I have never believed in flying saucers before, and I'm so mixed up now, and I don't know what to think. I'm so frightened. I won't stay at home by myself at night now. And Mr. Hebron said they did not report the incident to the local police because they were afraid that they would start laughing at us. And the military aviation authorities were at a loss to explain the episode. And they said there was no military aircraft or helicopters in the area at that time. Now, there's a third sighting. The sighting is the third of an unidentified flying objects in the Proston area in the previous 2 months. The third sighting. In February, the Wandle newsagent Mr. Arthur Martin saw 2 mysterious objects on the outskirts of the town. And a week later, several people at Wandle Hospital reported a UFO. And Mrs. Rhonda Braithwaite of Moombindari Station, which is a big ranch, 153 miles southwest of Cunnamulla in Queensland, said yesterday that she saw 3 large lights with trails like masses of little stars streaking across the sky at 6 a.m. on Tuesday. And also on Tuesday, 2 station hands at a central western property found a piece of metal that was believed to be from a Russian satellite. So it was a very active time in that 1972-1973 period. So thank you for joining me for another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. I've really enjoyed digging up those reports and investigating them for you and bringing them out for you to listen to, and hopefully you've learned something interesting. So until next time, I look forward to seeing you then. Good night.